Welcome everybody. Hello, my name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise. It's a great pleasure to be with you for your first or second or third cup of coffee, your first or second hour in the office, or if you're on the school run or walking the dog. Great to be with you. How times change and how they stay the same. Today, though, it's all about change. Our question is hydrogen the answer? To which your natural response might be, well, what is the question? And that is, in a sense, if we want to put it in familiar terms, how do we get to net zero? Or more broadly, how do we properly clean up global energy supply? Or as George Bush, the younger, might have put it, how do we finally end our addiction to oil? And then if we focus more on hydrogen, the question is it really the green energy store, that the Heineken of green energy stores that others haven't been able to reach? A green energy store that can heat homes, power ships, and power what used to be carbon intensive industrial processes, also trucks and buses? Or is it a magnet for magical thinking? Is it a bit like fusion? Is the hydrogen economy always going to be just over the horizon? Well, this is actually pretty timely. Boris Johnson made clear last week, not for the first time, that he thinks it is not about magical thinking, that hydrogen is going to be a key part of building back better, or whichever cliche we want to use. Airbus, as another example, is taking hydrogen very seriously. Some of you, especially those more clued in to hydrogen, may have seen their 3 hydrogen-powered concept planes. They almost looked as if they were actually flying on hydrogen. They were not, but by 2035, Airbus thinks they can have planes powered by hydrogen carrying passengers long distances up to 2,000 miles. And we've got 3 great guests this morning who all also take hydrogen pretty seriously. Before we get started, just a couple of things. One, full disclosure on my part. I am what you might call a very low-grade hydrogen wonk. Right at the beginning of my career as a journalist, I was a stringer in LA, and I read one of those wonderful pieces in American newspapers that start on page 1 and then they go to page A14 and they cover the whole of page A14 and the whole of page A15. And it was all about fuel cells, which I knew almost nothing about, except my dad had explained to me that hydrogen fuel cells powered spacecraft and that they were the future. And by the end of reading this piece, I thought unquestionably the future. And a bit later, for the first and only time in my life when I had a little bit of money spare, I spent it all on shares in a hydrogen fuel cell company called Ballard Power Systems. And I kept it and lost it all and sold them for almost nothing. They went up, then it went down. But the only reason I mention this now is that if I'd hung on to them then, about 20 years ago, I'd be quite rich now, certainly rich enough to buy a fuel cell powered car from Toyota or Hyundai or one of the few people who make them. So hydrogen is definitely happening. The other thing I wanted to say is just housekeeping. I am imagining that a lot of you know the drill, have been to Think-Ins before, but in case there are people on the call at the Think-In who haven't, the prime purpose is to solicit all your input, not just from our guest speakers, but from everybody, whether you feel that you know your way around this subject or not. Tessa's already asking me any other stock tips. I don't know whether to big up Ballard Power Systems going forward. I'm just saying I wish I'd stuck with them. And amazingly, they're still in business. That's one of the big surprises. But I am not a stock picker, Tessa. So that leads me to the point that you can get involved in the chat, or you can click and you can click on the participant button and you'll see a raise hand button, bottom right-hand corner. Please do raise your hand. And between me and my colleagues, Tom and Megan, Megan is a moonshotter, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. She is monitoring the chat. We will try and bring you in to the conversation. But before we get started, let's just test those digital hands. And since we're in the business breakfast slot, I think this is legitimate use of the raise hand function. Let's dig out the vested interest. Is there anybody else who, like me, over the past years, decades, has ever invested in hydrogen in any way? If you're not too shy, please raise your hand. You don't have to disclose, but this is good. There's just like 3/5 of a handful. Okay, and put your hands down, please. Thank you very much. Is there anybody who thinks that all this talk of hydrogen is, to coin a phrase, hot air? Hydrogen, I mean hydrogen as a vastly expanded component of the global energy infrastructure. So no out and out. Greg is an out and out skeptic. Well, thanks for raising your hand. And I would like to come to you and get your point of view at some point, if you'd be willing to share it with us. But thank you very much. And first, I want to come to Chris Jackson. Chris has joined us from his office, which I think is quite a new office. I've been teasing him about the chipboard behind his head. He is CEO and founder of Protium, which is a green hydrogen startup, but also you, Chris, have led hydrogen research at the World Bank in a past life. And so I think we know your answer to the question, is hydrogen the answer? But let me just throw it to you generally. Why is it the answer? And I told you that I'd bring up the whole Ballard thing. Can you summarize? For one of the things that Chris does is take part in a regular hydrogen podcast, and a recent guest was the current CEO of that company that I mentioned. I don't want to plug it unnaturally. That's not my point. He just seemed very compelling. I really like it if, amongst other things, you could summarize what you feel has happened in the past year in the hydrogen sphere that has kind of been a gear change.
Sure. So firstly, thank you very much for having me, Giles, and pleasure to meet everyone. I thought it may be worth just showing you, this is what a fuel cell actually looks like, by the way, because I'm not sure how many people have actually seen one. So this is actually a fuel cell. And I don't know if you can see it well, but just, again, a bit of context. I think sometimes when we talk about these things, we have very little perception of what we're really talking about. And they are very small. And if we're plugging things, you can actually buy your own little fuel cell set. They're portable online. So, you know, these things are not just for the big industrial players. You can actually take them apart yourself. So the question was why hydrogen is the answer. So I guess maybe starting with basics, it is not the sole answer. It's not a silver bullet. Hydrogen is one of several answers to how we get to net zero. I think quite often we like to think about problems as having one very simple solution. But in the issue of climate change and net zero, we really are talking about a myriad of different ways that we have to decarbonize our energy system. So let's start with the basics. Energy basically has three buckets: power, heat, and transport. And what we often forget when we think about the energy transformation is solar, wind, hydropower, and all those things are focused on the power sector. And power is only 20% of all final energy consumed in the world. The other 80% are heat and transport. And so even if we can electrify 100% our power system, that still leaves the other 80%. So the question is, how do we decarbonize that? So when we then start thinking a little bit about decarbonization of those sectors, we have to think, what is it that we value in those sectors? So in the gas sector, one of the things we value is storage. The gas grid is 3 times larger than the power grid in terms of the amount of energy that it actually stores, and it's capable of carrying us through enormous periods of strain and stress. So we have to have that capability to store energy for long periods of time and in large volumes to deal with certain unique events. We also have to have the ability to consume power at the point in time we need it. So solar and wind is able to generate very, very cheap power, but not at the drop of a hat. We have to be able to play with the elements. So we need a method of taking that energy, and being able to convert it to time periods where we actually need it. And then we look at transport. And transport has very specific requirements around weight. To move something requires a huge amount of energy, and the more weight that you apply to that object, the harder it is to move it. So when we try and electrify a technology purely by using a battery, every time we add more battery to give it more range, we add more weight, which then starts to work against the value in that. So hydrogen then complements batteries in vehicles called fuel cell vehicles by reducing some of the weight requirements in the battery. We still use a battery in a fuel cell vehicle. It's often forgotten that when we talk about hydrogen in the transport sector, we are talking about fuel cell electric vehicles. It's just that we're shifting some of the weight from batteries into hydrogen, which is lighter and easier to store and gives us a longer range as well as a faster recharge. So
Chris,
that,
sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask you, for people who are not familiar with fuel cells, can you just summarize the great thing about them, which is what they emit?
Yeah, absolutely. So fuel cell technology, essentially, well, the most common type of fuel cell technology, emphasize that, which I'm holding here in my hand, is a PEM fuel cell technology, which is what the company Ballard produce. Fuel cell combines hydrogen and oxygen over a membrane, and it creates electricity, a small amount of heat, and water. So a fuel cell electric vehicle solely emits water from the exhaust, but it will generate an electrical current that can power a vehicle, or indeed, last week it powered a plane to fly around Cranfield Airfield, which was the first commercial hydrogen plane flight in the world, a 6-seater flight by a company called Zero Avia.
Great, thank you. As I was saying, a lot seemed to have changed last year. There's been a sort of a hockey stick in terms of commercial interest. Am I right, or am I just falling for the hype?
No, you're absolutely right. So people forget. So hydrogen is a huge industrial market today. So what we're talking about in hydrogen is looking at hydrogen for the energy sector. So as an industrial gas, we produce 110 million tons of hydrogen annually. It's a $135 billion market. And we use 6% of all natural gas in the world and 2% of global coal to produce hydrogen. And actually in the UK, around 50% of the gas grid until the 1970s, or town gas grids, sorry, was hydrogen based. So a lot of experience with hydrogen, not a new sector. The reason why we're excited about it in energy is because hydrogen is not a source of energy, it's an energy carrier. We have to create hydrogen from something. We have to either extract it from water or we have to extract it from another fossil fuel. And so really, because you've always had to extract hydrogen from something or create it, people have always asked, well, why would you do that as opposed to just using the primary energy source? And so the reason why it's now exciting today is because of this push towards net zero. Because we've realized that the cost curves on solar and wind are coming down dramatically, but we now need to find ways to actually use all of that fantastic green electrons that we're creating at very low prices to then turn that into more valuable energy products. So we're talking about conversion of green electrons into green molecules. And we're also talking about how do we decarbonize the existing fossil fuels that we use. So we're
okay, Chris, I'm gonna interrupt you again there. Sorry.
Yep.
Green electrons, for people who again are not familiar with exactly how fuel cells work. Am I right that a hydrogen atom consists of a proton and an electron? And if you strip off those electrons, that is electricity, and that's what a fuel cell does. Am I right?
Yeah, it was, I guess, high level, yes. I mean, we're careful with fuel cell because hydrogen and fuel cells are often seen as synonymous, but they're not the same because hydrogen is an energy vector. It's a way of carrying energy. A fuel cell is one technology amongst many that consumes hydrogen, specifically usually for the creation of electricity, like you say. But hydrogen has many different uses beyond that. And it is important when we talk about it to keep them separate. The reason we often talk about fuel cell, and I'll stop because I know you want to dive in, is because the sister technology to a fuel cell is an electrolyzer. And an electrolyzer is what creates hydrogen by splitting water using renewable electricity. And when I say green electron, I mean electricity generated from renewable resources.
Right. No, I'm getting a slightly plaintive request, and it's perfectly understandable. How does hydrogen create electricity? And one of the light bulb moments that I had when reading that piece in the LA Times all those years ago was, oh my God, you put hydrogen in and you get out a stream of electrons, which is electricity. And what's left is hydrogen ions that combine with oxygen in the air to produce water, which dribbles out the tailpipe. And that's just such a wonderful thing compared with all the fumes that filled the LA skies when I lived there.
Well, if I may have one bit to that, and then I'll stop. Actually, the fun bit that I like with cars is that you've got to get the oxygen to combine it with the hydrogen. So where do you get the oxygen? Because you don't store it in a car. What you actually do is you have air filters at the front of a car. So a fuel cell electric vehicle actually cleans air when it drives through a city, because it has to filter the oxygen out of the surrounding air so that it can react with the hydrogen in the fuel cell. So when a Hyundai Nexo drives around London, an hour of driving time clears enough air for 42 people to breathe. So actually a fleet of fuel cell vehicles doesn't just emit water, it actually reduces particulate matter in an area, which I think is pretty cool.
It's very cool. Chris, I know that I think you and I could go on like this for a long time. We must resist the temptation. I want to come to Dr. Angie Needle, who is Director of Strategy at Cadent, which basically owns and runs our gas network, not the gas inside it, but the gas network. Now, Angie, I think not a lot of people know, and I certainly didn't until recently, that this is a pretty unleaky network, and we could start putting hydrogen into it almost now. How close are we to being able to use our current gas infrastructure for hydrogen, either pure hydrogen or mixed with the natural gas that's in it at the moment? And what would it take in terms of sort of engineering, but also investment to transition over to hydrogen completely?
Yeah. Morning. Good question. So Cadent manages the gas distribution network for pretty much half of England. So up to 11 million homes get gas every day, and we're responsible for delivering that safely. So and we've been working quite hard on hydrogen, because as you can imagine, the future of the gas distribution company and everybody who works there is ultimately dependent on what we choose to do around hydrogen. And it's an asset that people have already paid for. So, it's our duty, if you like, to make sure that we look at whether the system can be repurposed for hydrogen. So when we talk about repurposing for hydrogen, we've been looking across a couple of different areas. The first one is, can you blend hydrogen into the network today so that people can start using hydrogen in their homes or businesses or wherever it might be immediately? Now, as Chris quite rightly said, Towns Gas used to have about 50%, up to 50% hydrogen in it already. So a lot of the network and the older network is used to carrying hydrogen. And we've been through a mains replacement program. If you see the big yellow pipes being reeled out, digging up your road, we've been doing that for quite a few years, and we've got a few more years to go. And that is just a normal replacement program of those assets. Once you get a plastic pipe in, it's pretty much hydrogen ready. And we're doing our own assessments of both blends of hydrogen and 100% hydrogen on the pipes, the valves, the joints, the pumps, because it's under pressure. And what we haven't found anything that makes it more dangerous, if you like, than currently. And it's quite important, because hydrogen carries a lot of energy. It takes up 3 times the volume as natural gas for the same amount of energy. So we'd have to have the network under a little bit more pressure to make sure you get the same energy that you're used to. So how long is it going to take for the network to be ready? Well, we're doing our own projects on the readiness of our assets for hydrogen. And over the next 3 years or so, we're going to have whole sections of gas network that we're going to test for hydrogen, so that we can look at all different kinds of assets, at the age of them, how long they've been underground, all that kind of stuff, which we can make sure that when we do introduce hydrogen, it won't have an impact on rates of leaks and things like that. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that we've been doing quite a lot of work on blending hydrogen into the existing gas network. We've got a big project going at Keele University. Keele's got its own gas distribution network. We've been making green hydrogen from electrolysis. We've been putting it into the gas grid, and 100 homes at Keele University have been heated with their existing natural gas that's got 20% hydrogen in it. No impact on the boilers, no impact on comfort, on warmth. So your boiler today could have up to 20% by volume hydrogen in it, and you can start decarbonise your heating, if you like, without changing your assets, your boilers. As you get to 100% hydrogen, we would need to change appliances, as we did when we did Towns Gas. I wasn't here then, fortunately, but we had to sort of change all the boilers, because boilers are designed to burn a specific type of fuel. So as you go to hydrogen, you could do that. And it's great because we're working with Worcester Bosch and Baxi and those kinds of companies for starting to prototype and make hydrogen ready boilers. So next time you get a new boiler, it could burn natural gas and hydrogen. And when you switch or transition between them, an engineer can come and do a small change to your boiler and make it hydrogen, burn hydrogen. So starting to think about how that transition might go. I'm just looking at the chat. There's loads of questions about colourless and odorless and stuff. So I'm happy
let's get into some of this practical stuff. When I am forced to change my boiler to a hydrogen one, will it look very different, or will it do the same thing in a slightly different way? And my other question, Ollie might like to know. Ollie wants to know about the smell.
Yep.
If I've got pure hydrogen coming out of my gas hob, right?
Yep.
Is that safe, and what colour's the flame?
Yeah, good question. So we have been doing a lot of work on, and BEIS have as well, the government, in terms of 100% hydrogen in homes. What does it mean? Does it leak? If you knock a nail into the gas pipe, what happens? What does your boiler look like? What does your cooker look like? So hydrogen is a colourless gas and it doesn't smell. And when it burns, you can see it, but not as much as you can natural gas. So in the research that we've done so far, we put odorants in natural gas. You may not be aware, but the smell of natural gas is, we actually dose the natural gas with that particular smell. So that odorant you can use for hydrogen. So when you smell hydrogen, it will smell the same as natural gas, and people will know it's a gas leak. That's really important. For the colour of it, because it does burn slightly differently, we've been doing work on it with a lot of appliance manufacturers, and the appliance manufacturers of cookers and hobs and fires in particular, you can change the burner so that it burns with an orange flame. So you can see it, so you can change it so you can see it. And the most important thing, I think, just to make everybody aware, is that Cadent and companies like Cadent, we're safety organisations. And so the health and safety executive has to agree that we can put hydrogen in our mains, and they have to agree that we can put 100% in people's homes. And they will only agree to that if it is at least as safe as today, preferably safer. So they're the things that we're looking at. Now, the good thing about hydrogen is that it's very, very light. If it leaks, it dissipates much quicker than natural gas. Okay. So there's some pros and cons, and obviously you don't need your carbon monoxide alarm anymore, because it produces water when you burn it. So I know this is different from a fuel cell. We're not making electricity from it. In a boiler, you're burning it. Yeah.
Okay. Angie, thank you very much. I want to come back to you in a little bit, not least on numbers, but let's take a step back from the nitty gritty for a second. I want to come to Chris Goodall, who is editor and writer of Carbon Commentary, which I commend to you, and also author of What We Need to Do Now to Get to Net Zero. And Chris has been on Think-ins with us on the road before. Chris, I'm going to plug your book by reading from it. I took a picture, a screen grab. Let me see if I can find that. Photos. Last photo. Okay. Because this is quite exciting for a Tuesday morning. My proposal, hydrogen features in, like, as far as I can tell, half your chapter headings. My proposal for our route to zero carbon emissions is for a 20-fold expansion of renewable electricity. This will produce far more power than will be needed, even after we have electrified transport and some heating. But it is essential. If we massively overbuild cheap wind and solar farms, we will have surplus electricity almost all the time, and we will be able to close all remaining gas power stations. Okay, it's a tremendously exciting vision for solar and wind everywhere. But what's the next step? How does that fit into a hydrogen economy of the future?
Thank you, Giles, and thank you everybody for coming. If we massively increase the amount of electricity we generate, we'll have electricity for all the times, from almost all the time, and for therefore 90% of the hours of each week, we will have surplus electricity that will need to be used. And the easiest, simplest way of using that surplus electricity is to make hydrogen, and to use that hydrogen for the variety of things that have already been spoken about by the other speakers, for some transport applications, such as aviation, for some large industrial applications, such as steel manufacturing or fertilizer manufacturing, for perhaps domestic heating, although we should try and electrify as much domestic heating as we possibly can. And lastly, for turning back into electricity through a fuel cell or through combustion in a conventional or nearly conventional gas turbine to make electricity when even our 20 times expansion of electricity generation capacity isn't quite enough for us. So that is, I think, my vision of the future. It is to say, let's dive for renewables. We are blessed with enormous, almost infinite quantities of offshore wind potential. And it's going to be cheaper than probably any other single source of electricity for us. But let's combine that with hydrogen. Renewables plus hydrogen is a route to 100% decarbonisation of our economy. There is virtually nothing that we can't do without electricity or hydrogen.
Okay, but while we're on it, a 20-fold expansion is colossal. Let's park the whole question of investment. Where do you put the turbines?
Well, most of that, in my vision, is wind turbines, as you say. We can put a lot more solar power onto roofs, into areas which otherwise wouldn't be used for agriculture on land in the UK. But offshore wind is going to be the predominant source. Now, in my calculations, there's an article on this, which I've written recently on my website, Carbon Commentary. I think we're going to use approximately, to generate enough electricity, we'd need approximately 1/3 of the shallow water capacity around the UK. We have an exclusive economic zone around the UK, which the UK is entitled to use for renewable energy developments. Quite a lot of that is shallow enough to operate existing types of wind turbines. And we could, if we expanded enough, cover large parts, particularly of the North Sea, with offshore wind turbines and generate that 20 times multiple of electricity generation from renewables that I've suggested. It's going to occupy approximately, as I say, 1/3 of the total shallow area which the UK has under its control. Produces also potential to do more than that and to export hydrogen to the other countries of Northern Europe. And indeed, Germany's already begun inquiries about the capacity of the UK, particularly Scotland, to generate surplus hydrogen for export into Northern European markets.
Well, guys, a vision of the future. Thank you very much, Chris. We ran a net zero moonshot exercise over the summer with a number of Tortoise volunteer members. I'm eternally grateful to them. A huge blind spot on my part was that we never tackled hydrogen, but one of our moonshotters, Megan, is running the chat and has very gallantly agreed to talk us through the slides that you might have seen in passing just before we sort of started. Let's just take a slightly more leisurely look at them now. Is that okay, Megan? Can we unmute Megan? That's lovely.
Okay, so morning everyone. This first slide basically shows sort of the amount of energy which hydrogen would be able to sort of the amount of energy in hydrogen in comparison to sort of batteries and diesel and petrol. So if you see the 3 yellow dots on the bottom right hand side of the graph, that represents hydrogen, and you can see it compared with batteries, so lithium ion batteries and nickel zinc batteries. So you can see that hydrogen produces far more energy than batteries. And while diesel and petrol have a far higher energy density than hydrogen, you can see that even they don't produce as much energy as hydrogen does. So yeah, could we have the next slide? So the key point to note about this this slide is sort of the role of hydrogen in flattening the curve between sort of supply and demand, or consumption and production. So with renewable energy sources, so for example, solar power, obviously you'll get the most amount of energy in the middle of the day when the sun is at its highest and obviously it's hottest. But with hydrogen, you can store the energy which would be produced sort of at the heat of the day, and it will basically make sort of renewable energy a bit more efficient than it is at the moment, because obviously it's so dependent on different variables. Like with solar panels, it's obviously sunlight, and that will flatten the curve because obviously consumption and production don't really line up, as you can see from the sort of the two lines, the red and green at the top. So yeah, hydrogen would basically help us to, well, specifically green hydrogen would help us to make renewable energy a bit more efficient than it currently is. We have the next slide. So this slide shows how hydrogen fits into the bigger picture. So you can use electricity to split water into hydrogen and water, and which you can then use to heat houses and power buses. But obviously you can see with the fuel cells, you can do the reverse. So you can push hydrogen into fuel cells and then you can get electricity and water from that. So it's kind of like a circular sort of two-way motion. You can both store electricity with hydrogen and get electricity from hydrogen. Could we have the next slide? So the top figure, the $150 billion, basically shows that, so green hydrogen is particularly expensive to make, and to make it competitive, you need to subsidize it. So that is the top figure that is showing sort of how much we'd need in subsidies to make green hydrogen competitive. And then the bottom figure, the $600 billion, just shows how much would be needed to completely switch sort of the world's gas storage infrastructure. So in things like boilers and things, to completely switch to hydrogen power instead of natural gases and things that we have at the moment. So yeah, that's the amount of money it would require. Could we have the next slide, please? So this slide basically shows the interest which various countries and obviously the EU have expressed in hydrogen. So you can see obviously Boris Johnson has been particularly interested and said that it's going to be incredibly important in the UK's journey to net zero, and similarly with the US. So yeah, there's a lot of appetite, but it'll be interesting to see where the action is. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Megan. 2 points, if I may, before I forget. I want to invite Greg Kubas, if I'm pronouncing your surname right. I saw your hand go up as possibly as a skeptic earlier. I'd be interested to come to you in a minute if you'd be interested in sharing your view, especially if it's changed over the last half an hour. It may not have done, or it may have been reinforced. But first I want to come back to Angie and the fourth slide there, where you saw two figures. Those were taken from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and full disclosure, used by The Economist. Do you, and the second of those, it's a notional global figure, $600 billion to retrofit or re-engineer the world's gas storage infrastructure for hydrogen. Is that the kind of headline figure that you recognize?
It's a bit of a tricky one, this, because we haven't worked out exactly where hydrogen's going to go at the moment, and so that's why we're all waiting for the hydrogen strategy. So the government's committed to producing a strategy in the new year. When next year, I'm not quite sure, but it is coming, and that'll be really important because that will set out the goals and aspirations. So if you imagine in the UK's energy system, hydrogen is going to be used to store energy for power generations. At the moment, you know, half roughly of our electricity is from natural gas. So there's going to have to be a huge investment in production of hydrogen, both blue and green, to get to the scale that we need to get to. And that is going to require a sort of incentive mechanism support, because ultimately making hydrogen is still more expensive than natural gas. So that is going to need support. Then we've got to work out, where is hydrogen going to go? Right, where do we need
Angie, can you just explain? I'm not sure if we've covered this, and forgive me if I've been distracted by something else. The difference between blue and green.
Yeah, I'll tell you briefly. So blue hydrogen's made from methane, natural gas, where you extract the hydrogen from the methane, and the carbon, the CO2 that's remaining has to be captured and stored. So it's a bit problematic, because it's not entirely carbon neutral, because you're still producing CO2, and the capture rate is between 90 and 95% at the moment for good capture processes. So blue hydrogen, however, and scaled blue hydrogen is less expensive at the moment than green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is where you make hydrogen purely from renewable electricity. You can say it's 100% zero carbon. Well, we've done assessments on how, in our need to get to net zero, how much hydrogen do you need and how much of each do you need? You kind of need both at scale to get to where you need to go. There are other types of hydrogen, by the way. There's brown hydrogen, which is made without capturing the CO2, and there's pink hydrogen, which is from energy from nuclear to make that hydrogen. So there's actually other kinds of hydrogen, but the fact is it's an energy vector, as Chris was saying, and you can use it to take energy where it needs to go. And our priority is making, I mean, we just transport gas as a distribution company, but the government is putting effort into making sure that the type of hydrogen is very much aligned with the net zero aspiration.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris wanted to respond, I think, possibly to something in the slides, but I do also want to come to a very important question raised by Dom Herndl in the chat. But Chris first. Sorry, Chris Jackson.
We're okay,
Apologies.
Yeah. That's fine. No, I just wanted to say, I mean, when we talk about numbers, so $150 billion needed to make green hydrogen competitive and $600 billion needed to switch all gas in the gas infrastructure globally to hydrogen. Context. So globally, we spend $1.2 trillion a year on energy infrastructure, right? 1.2 trillion. And we spend around $300 billion a year, so globally, on renewable infrastructure. So those numbers, relatively speaking, are pretty small. And I think people often don't realize how small that actually is. UK alone spends £150 billion a year on all forms of energy. That's gas, that's petrol, that's power, right? So context. The other quick piece is this question around when hydrogen is competitive. And so actually things like renewable hydrogen, and I'll be quick about it, already in some applications are competitive, but you just have to pick your application. And so this is the other thing to remember. It's not that everything is going to be immediately cheaper than natural gas, but there are already some areas where it is cheaper. And that's why there are some businesses that are doing very well in this space. And I think that's important to emphasize. The sector is not sitting there going, we need tons and tons of subsidies. The direction of travel is net zero. There is investment already going in, and there are markets. What we're looking for, which Angie's right, is a strategy, because if you don't know what the government regulations are going to be, and the government suddenly says, well, we don't want a gas grid anymore, well, that somewhat changes what you're going to do with investments. So it's more knowing strategically what the government wants to do and where they see the role for hydrogen the industry needs, as opposed to being told, we must have the same, billions and billions of subsidies. Don't worry, it would be good to have some of that, but at the end of the day, the discussion can't just be about subsidy for the system. It has to be about a broader piece, which is, if we're serious about net zero, we will find competitive niches, and the industry is already doing that. Okay,
fair enough. I think I see that. Is it true, though, broadly, and I'd like to hear from the other Chris on this, if you want to dive in, that at the moment, green hydrogen is a multiple more expensive to produce than blue or brown. And so one way or another, big picture, long term, you've got to redirect investment on a massive scale to achieve economies of scale, to bring down the sort of the unit price of green hydrogen, so that everybody is incentivized to produce it. Is that broadly true?
It's not so much economies of scale, Giles, first, if I may interrupt there. It is the fact that the cost of hydrogen is very largely dependent upon the cost of the electricity used to generate the electrolysis process.
Right.
So as the cost of renewable electricity comes down, hydrogen becomes cheaper. But there's more, I think there's a more important point. As we install more renewable electricity around Europe, around the world, we will find that there are more and more moments when that electricity, part of that electricity, isn't needed. We've got too much. We're seeing that already in the UK, and we're seeing it in very large quantities in other countries of Northern Europe, Denmark, Germany, and so on and so forth. When the wind is blowing, the sun is shining, we've got too much electricity. And at that time, the market price of electricity can fall to zero or below zero. And at that time, therefore, there is no cost. In the best circumstances, there's actually no cost to making hydrogen. And what we're finding is that for the big offshore wind projects that are now being started around Northern Europe, the developers of those sites, Denmark, Netherlands, are actually including hydrogen capacity in their applications, because they know that there will be sufficient, there will be periods when it's more economic to make hydrogen at pretty much a zero cost than it is to generate electricity, which will then sell for net less than zero. So the point I've just tried to make very briefly is that when hydrogen becomes competitive, it's partly a question of the price of electricity, but it's also partly a function of how much surplus electricity there is going to be in our systems. As I say, at the moment, we're finding periods of surplus electricity when actually the creation of hydrogen is economically logical already.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I want to come to two people in the chat. I've mentioned already, just scrolling back, the question was about storage. Dom, we sometimes have this idea, we'd rather you sort of hold forth than ask a question, but you have such a good question that I want you to ask it. Can we come to Dom Herndl?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I've read a great deal about the difficulties of storing hydrogen. Obviously, it's the lightest element, and my understanding is that it leaks very badly, and that we've glossed over the idea that we can store it and transport it very quickly in the desire to see its application or to envisage its application. Is that a concern, and how will we get around it?
Let's go to Chris Jackson first on that. And I should say, I'd really like to know, for fuel cell vehicles, apart from anything, are we looking at compressed or liquefied at the moment? And is there any hope? There used to be the wonderful dream of the 5,000-mile hydrogen tank based on carbon nanostructures. Is that all for the birds now?
No, so okay, let's do so 3 of the more vanilla storage technologies. Pressurized hydrogen, So you can pressurize it to 40 bar or up to 1,000 bar. So a fuel cell electric vehicle will have 700 bar pressurized hydrogen, and a bus will be around 350 bar. That's one way of storing it. The other way of storing it is to cool it and to also pressurize it slightly. So this is called cryogenic or liquid hydrogen. That's very widely done. It's quite often done in the space program originally, but it's now also used for forklifts in the US. So there's 30,000 forklifts in the US run by Plug Power in a quarter of all Walmart and Amazon distribution centers that use liquid hydrogen, then compressed into hydrogen for their little forklifts. And then the other area is salt caverns. And there are actually 6 salt caverns in the world at the moment that store hydrogen. 3 of them are in the UK. One is in Teesside, and I think the other is around Middlesbrough, and there's a third, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head where it is.
I think
So
Angie owns some of them.
I think, do you? I thought it was all BOC. I could be taken wrong.
Oh, well.
BOC owned 3 or 2.
There's one in Liverpool, isn't there? Anyway.
I think plans to have one. Anyway, sorry. So those are the 3 main ones. There are then other ways of storing it. So one is actually conversion. People sometimes forget you can actually convert hydrogen into other fuels, and we haven't talked about that, but you can create green ammonia or green methanol, or actually you can recreate synthetic natural gas. So capture CO2 from somewhere else, combine green hydrogen from water and offshore wind, and actually make natural gas that has 0 carbon footprint or is carbon negative. So that's another way, but what you're referring to is solid state hydrogen storage. So actually you can capture hydrogen and bond it into a solid. There are technologies that do that. There's a company in the UK called H2Go Power. I would go and check it out. And the CEO is a good friend of mine at NASA, Bohamed. They've actually flown a drone around at the moment, which has hydrogen stored in a solid container. You can throw it against a wall, you can run over it in a car, you can do whatever you want to it, and nothing is going to happen. It has a lower storage volume, which is one of the challenges, but it's phenomenally safe, and there's no pressure and there's no liquid. So those sorts of technologies are coming. There are a couple of companies that are doing that at the moment. So I would advise you to watch the space. Okay,
thank you. And did that address the sort of leakiness concern, Dom?
I mean, it's reassuring. My impression, though, is that, yes, we can probably create large, if you like, centers or storage mechanisms, but the idea of using something like the national gas grid to distribute hydrogen, from what I've read and from what I've heard, is problematic. We lose a lot. And it's a genuine question. I'm not trying to make a point. One hopes that this can be done. It's interesting that they did that in the past, but the idea that an extremely flammable gas is leaking on 20 to 30%. If we tried to distribute it in a similar manner to the national gas grid, that seems alarming.
Okay, just very quickly, I should come to Angie on that, and then I want to come to Caroline McGee. That's presumably an abbreviation, just because I think you raise an interesting question. Angie, a leaky network. Are we back to the dissipation factor?
Yeah, so I mean, I get the concern, right? Because it is a light gas. It does seep through materials because the molecular size is very small. But just talk about salt storage, right? So if we're going to electrify a lot of heating, which we will do with heat pumps, or hybrid systems, which basically means you're only going to need hydrogen for in the middle of winter when it's not windy. I mean, today's not a windy day and it's cold, right? You're going to have to find the energy from somewhere, so you need a place to store it. So if those of you who don't know what a salt cavern looks like, companies like Innovan and Store Energy own salt caverns. They're about the size of Wembley Stadium, and they look like a crystal inside because they're carved out of salt, and they're amazing things, and they hold hydrogen today safely and securely. And similarly with the gas distribution network, as I was saying earlier, we expect to be able to repurpose it for hydrogen without there being, any leaks from a safety perspective. Elsewhere, how would you get hydrogen transported? So it's quite important that we go through our testing program, reassure ourselves and the health and safety executives that hydrogen can be safely transported. And then when it comes to homes or whatever use or application, it's not just in homes actually, industry will come first. Hydrogen's you know, it's used to be using hydrogen in chemical and manufacturing processes. So pipelines for hydrogen, the transport of hydrogen pipelines is not a new thing.
Thank you, Angie. I think we should have a Tortoise field trip to a salt cavern, though presumably what I can't understand is if you get inside to see it like that, then surely it's already leaking hydrogen because you got in there. I mean,
it'll probably have to be empty if you wanted to go in.
Oh, I see. All right. Okay. Caroline, can we come to you? And forgive me for calling you Caroline McGee, because you're asking about obstacles, and that seems to me a pretty important question. Caroline, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just want to know really what the main blocks are to this moving forward. Where are we seeing the problems with getting this to be used more widely, but people to actually understand it? Because I knew nothing until today at all, and never even really come into my consciousness. So it would just be interesting to see whether we need to do a lot of work on education and public perception before we can even start this moving forward, or where the drivers need to be.
Let's come to Chris Jackson first, and then I think it's a really good question. There's in many people's minds, there's a disconnect between, you know, the present, our gas that smells and blue flame and rubbing along, you know, continuing to power global warming and feeling bad about it, and Chris Goodall's vision. How do we get from here to there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think where we really are sort of trying to start at this stage is that we are trying to deploy at commercial scale technologies we already know are scalable. So for example, London's had 10 fuel cell buses that ran for 10 years, as has Aberdeen, as has Birmingham. So, you know, we just get those deployments up, which means we need to approve infrastructure and we need to get local authorities to start purchasing them. We actually can do that easily. There's 3 companies in the UK that actually manufacture fuel cell buses. So some really obvious things are just deploying systems we know already work and getting them out there into the field. The other bit then is education and awareness and testing. So to the point made by Dom, how do we get people confident around the fact that these are safe? So there's a program called High for Heat that the government is running, where they've actually funded the creation of a street, which has got 4 houses up in Scotland, and they cut the pipelines at different pressures and they leak gas and they measure how much it comes into the home and how safe it will be. And I think things like that and just building that confidence with the public is really important. The Newcastle University did a big study on this and said that, you know, most people don't know anything about hydrogen, exactly to the point just raised. You know, generally when the public asks about hydrogen, their first question is, what is hydrogen? And then when you spend time to educate them, there is a lot of interest, but the question then is about cost. So this is then when the government needs to set a very clear strategy around net zero and say, right, we've said we want to be net zero by 2050. What are the technologies we want? What role do we see for those? And then people who want to invest, companies like Cadent, companies like mine, companies, you know, like Unilever, for example, that are looking at hydrogen for their systems, can plan long term and say, right, this is the direction of travel and I will invest. But without that key strategic structure from the government, which I understand will now come in January, it has been very difficult in the UK. And fortunately, countries like France and Germany have released hydrogen strategies. And so that has put a lot of pressure on ministers to act. And so I think you will see increasingly, as you noted at the beginning of the conversation, Giles, a big move in the next 6 to 12 months, not only educate and get policymakers on board to set the structure so that we can achieve something like Chris Goodall's vision, but also just increasing the awareness amongst the public. And one thing to watch out for is there's a group called the Hydrogen Council. It represents companies with revenues over $3 trillion globally. And they have just started a campaign called the Hydrogen Champions campaign. This is a global social media marketing campaign aimed at ordinary individuals, not business, not policymakers. They're going to have hydrogen documentaries. They've got dedicated Instagram, Twitter, and probably soon TikTok channels. They're going to have celebrities coming on and talking about what they think is interesting about hydrogen. And the whole idea of that is to make this more tangible and accessible for ordinary people, and to make websites that have really simple Hydrogen 101s and illustrations and photos of what things look like. So I think that's what you can expect to see in the next 6 to 12 months. And hopefully that will be a big driver in actually getting us from the vision today to where we need to get to meet our climate commitments.
Thanks, Chris. Chris Goodall, briefly, because I want to ask all 3 of you one final question before we run out of time. What do you see as the big sort of structural obstacles to a large-scale transition to hydrogen, and how should they be overcome? Thinking in terms of the kinds of incentives, perhaps that national and supranational bodies might practically be able to put in place.
Well, there will be a need to subsidise the effectively the cost of hydrogen to the end user. At the moment, in places like Spain, that's happening through the utility company subsidising it. There'll be need for, as Chris Jackson said, massive subsidy. Germany's promised 9 billion, France 7 billion to the hydrogen sectors over the next few years. It's a key part of the green relaunch. There are no insurmountable structural obstacles that don't, in the end, come down to money.
And without wishing to go down a rabbit hole, we've discussed this at other thinkings quite often. To get money flowing in a new direction, is that all going to depend on a carbon price?
We move into a very, very disputed area here, Giles. I think a carbon price would be massively useful across the whole of the energy transition. But that's because I come from an economics background, and economists are united on this single issue. There's only one issue which economists united on. That's the value of a carbon price. It would be transformative for the development of a hydrogen economy.
Thanks very much. There's a fun question from John Boxall. I'm going to read it out just for economy of time. Forgive me, John, for not actually training the camera on you. How many of those fuel cells, Chris, that you held up at the beginning would be needed to power a car for 300 miles? And how much hydrogen?
Sure. So how much hydrogen? So Toyota Mirai is 5 kilos of hydrogen, and a Hyundai Nexo is about the same. For buses, it's maybe around 10 to 15 kilos, and trucks nearer 40. So that's the amount. In terms of how many of these, so this is actually like a relatively small stack. So the way that you have to think about fuel cells is it's modular, a little bit like batteries. You add them in strings and you stack them together. So in a lot of the fuel cell vehicles today, they use around 100 kilowatt stack is what they will use. But you can use much smaller. If you want to see a really tiny, super highly efficient version of this, there's a Welsh automotive car company called River Simple. You can go and check out their car online. It's a 2-seater coupe. They use a very, very small fuel cell system because they've got an extremely efficient car design. So I think theirs is like 20 kilowatt or 15 kilowatt system. So 15 kilowatts, to give you an idea, would be about the electrical demand of an ordinary home, or 1.5 ordinary homes, which, you know, if you actually look at how much power there is in those cars, is about right.
Thanks very much. My last question for all of you, and since we're with you, Chris Jackson, I'll stay with you right now, is fast forward to 2035, 2040, whenever you want to, look back and tell us, how did we sell hydrogen? What was the inflection point? What was the genius line, or the single policy innovation that tipped us over into a glorious hydrogen future, looking back from whenever you want to look back from? What was it?
Well, the line that I like is, we're powering the world with sun, wind, and water. We talk to food and drink manufacturing businesses, and there's nothing more appealing than saying we can manufacture your products the same way that you grow your ingredients. We use water, we use sun, we use wind. And if you can't sell that to an investor, to customers, and to policymakers, that simple message, I don't think you can sell anything in the energy transition. And I think that is a huge part of it. What we forget in energy transition is that whenever we've changed, when we move from trees to coal, or when we move from coal to gas, or even to electric, we usually did it because it was exciting and it offered us new capabilities that the previous system didn't. It rarely came down to cost in the first instance. So what we have to remember here is, what can hydrogen do and what can fuel cells do that is different to what other energy technologies allow us to do today? So, you know, I think what will catch people is air quality, personally, for me, in cities. I think the idea that people can have fleets of cars and buses running outside their schools and their homes that make the air cleaner and emit nothing but water is going to be what captures people's imagination. And the ability to fly around the world without having to feel guilty about their carbon footprint, or to be able to order goods online knowing that actually that the whole process is sustainable. That, I think, is going to be the messaging that sells this to people, that there is a transition. It's a gas we've used before. We know how to produce it. We know how to store it. And importantly, we know what the risks involved are with it. Now,
Okay, I've got to stop you there, Chris, because I don't want people to have to run off to their 9 o'clock calls. Well, they will have to. Chris Goodall, very briefly, how did we sell it, looking back?
We sold it. Well, look, I can't improve upon what Chris Jackson said. That's absolutely the way forward. The fact is that if we're going to go renewables, 100% renewables, we need hydrogen. There is no alternative.
Okay, thank you. Angie,
Yeah.
looking back with great pride at your children and grandchildren, one of whom I saw wandering behind you when we were speaking earlier, how did we sell hydrogen?
Yeah, so it's a global race, hydrogen. And I genuinely believe that the UK could be at the centre of this global race. We need investors to invest. And one way of doing that is putting a production incentive in place for hydrogen to attract investment.
A production incentive?
Yeah, get some hydrogen being made would be my first step.
Okay, so that's a very practical incentive that could be offered to industry. You make it, we subsidize it initially. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much. I'm going to let you go in a second. I just want to note that I feel, even as a self-identifying hydrogen wonk, that I've learned a great deal. The paltry amount that the UK is offering, even though we're talking a big game in terms of subsidy compared with France and Germany, 350 million, or a portion of that compared with 7 billion and 9 billion for France and Germany respectively. It was the first time I've ever heard of pink hydrogen from nuclear power. That's fascinating. We didn't get into electrolysis, but perhaps that's part of a hydrogen primer that we need to produce at Tortoise, just to go over the basics for sort of new readers start here. Salt caverns and the, I think, image of a 20-fold increase in renewable power generation floating on a third of our shallow waters is something to think about, along with 30,000 hydrogen-powered forklifts already in use in Walmart and Amazon warehouses. It's been an interesting mixture today of dreams and visions that might be realized in 10, 20 years' time, and stuff that is actually happening now that not enough of us know about. But a few more of us know a bit about it now. Thanks to Chris and Angie and all of you for joining us. It's 9:04. It only remains to me to thank you all again and invite you to wave to our speakers, even though we can't applaud them. And thank you, Megan. And have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining us.